8:45 tonight. Baked goods and coffee will be available through the end of the event at 9. We have a little donation box here. It helps pay for flyers for all of the events that we put on here. So if you want to drop a little something in there, that'd be great. And also, please don't forget to tip your servers. They're working like crazy back there for you and trying to identify all of you by your shirts. So, all right, I'm going to turn it over to Brendan here to introduce our presenters tonight.
All right, guys, it's good to have everybody here. Let me find out the right range. Okay. We are representatives from Shimer College, and this event is called Learning About Learning, the Tumultuous History of the Great Books Education in America. Essentially what Shimer does is it is a school where the class sizes are no larger than 12 people. All of the classes are discussion-based rather than lecture-based, and primarily instead of like a lot of paperwork or tests, we more do readings and are kind of graded on our discussions in class. So it has a very long history that we're going to be learning about, and we have Drs. David Shiner, Barbara Stone, and Stuart Patterson here, who are all facilitators at our college. That's what we call them, facilitators, not professors. And I think the general structure for tonight is going to be that the last 30 minutes are a Q&A, and everything leading up until then will kind of be presentations by these three who are allowed to interact with each other a little bit and talk. It's not just going to be one person speaking the entire time. But you will have a chance to kind of get your say-so in the last 30 minutes. So if you have some burning questions, just kind of hold on through until then. And I believe our first presenter is Stuart. All right, yeah, Stuart, this is the way.
So hi everybody, welcome. And I'm wondering, has anyone here heard of Shimer College? What I'm actually wondering is there anyone here who hasn't heard of Shimer College before tonight? Okay. This is for you. We hope you stay. So I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to fill up 33% of the time before you guys get to your questions. So frankly, if you have questions or you want to say something or you want clarification from me, please feel free. I have been delegated to speak on sort of the deep background of the Great Books education in the United States. And I'm going to give a very sort of potted history of higher education, basically, from about the time of the foundation of what is considered the oldest university in Europe, which is in the city of Bologna, in Italy. And it dates back to about 1088. I think that's right. Is that right? 1088?
Yeah, I think so.
She's Italian.
I know everything, yeah.
And our familiar Oxford, which dates to 10 or 11. I think the official date is something like 11. And then Cambridge is about 2 generations after that. Cambridge, the founding of Cambridge is interesting, and this will give you a character of higher education. It hasn't changed much. You hear about party schools. But there's a book that I would recommend to you all if you want sort of a really nice, vivid picture of what the higher education used to be like. And that is Wyndham Lewis, the novelist Wyndham Lewis, and painter. Some of you may know his paintings. He was a vorticist, so-called. I think he made that word up with pound. Anyway, he wrote a book on sort of a fanciful biography of the poet François Villon, who was sort of a thief poet. And in it, there are very few facts that are sort of certain about François Villon's life, except for when he was hung, and at certain points in his life when he was in jail. And everything else around him is sort of legend. But Wyndham Lewis took this stuff and structured the story of François Villon's life. And it's just a really wonderful sort of evocation of what university life in mid to late medieval times was. And just to give you a sense, Cambridge was founded when in Oxford there was a brawl So there was a sort of a town gown thing going on. There was a brawl, and it was over watered ale, which is to say a couple of students went to one of the local drinking establishments and had some of the ale and complained that it had been watered down. And so for about a week, the town and the gown people went at it. And somebody, at least one person lost his life. And some students had to flee Oxford. And so, but they wanted to keep up with their studies. And so they lit out for the East Fens and set up in Cambridge. And that's how Cambridge got founded. So if you thought your lives were interesting. So anyway, so that just to give you a sense that they were seminaries in the early days. You would go and you would learn your letters, but mostly what you were doing was studying to be a churchman of some sort or another. And for those of you who've been to Oxford, you've seen the divinity schools where the examinations would take place, and what you would do is you would stand in a dock like you were a prisoner, and the assorted doctors' letters would sit there and just grill you. So it was a day-long examination to take place, and it was usually in the dead of winter, and you were standing there, almost nothing, and they were just grilling you and grilling you and grilling you on the finer points of Aquinas. You just sort of pick something you have to know how to think so. So that, it was really sort of geared, education was geared to the church. Now, you've all maybe, you've at least heard of Erasmus and More and that set, the so-called humanists. Well, the humanists comes in what we know of as the liberal arts. Right? They were reviving a great deal of the ancient sort of educational, the shape of ancient education, which had named the liberal arts. There weren't universities per se. Basically, in ancient times, you would have a teacher. There were schools. They weren't what we consider. They weren't even as diverse in their own ways as the University of Oxford, Bologna, for example, which did have some division into subjects. And you would have divisions in subjects at places like the Academy or the Lyceum, Plato's or Aristotle's schools, their establishments. But really more, they were sort of, what you would liken them to exactly in this day and age, but not quite cults, but sort of organized salons, yeah, sort of like business schools, sort of, in their own, in a way, because you were learning how to be a rhetorician, you would be sort of approved to do this and that, and you'd have that reputation. Anyway, so the humanists come along and they reintroduce the so-called liberal arts, the trivium and the quadrivium, which are a little trivia. What is the trivia?
Law and logic and...
What is it?
Law and logic.
Grammar.
No, that's the
Grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
Grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And the quadrivium?
Arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. The ancients know.
You're a free man. Everybody else in here is
They're stuck.
what they call a natural slave. So anyway, sorry. I know I'm going to get it after this. So the humanists reintroduce what we know of as the liberal arts. Now, the university evolves from there. It's not sort of smooth sailing from then on. What comes in between is what, sort of being very brief and sort of getting through this. Barbara, in conversation earlier, brought up the German Research University, and for that we have to thank a fellow named Alexander von Humboldt, after which our beloved Humboldt Park is named. This was a rock star in his day. And just around the world you'll find things named after Humboldt, and because he was just a hugely admired man and represented sort of the spirit of the age, insofar as that he idealized this and actually then materialized this idea of universal knowledge. not in one person, though he aspired to that sort of, kind of culture, but in terms of a society and its knowledge and its ability to sort of systematize its knowledge and its practices in the university. Now it has forebears as well in things like the Royal Academy and other kinds of academies, sort of study institute, research institutes that would be sort of subvented by the state or by subscription or both in some ways. But Humboldt is really responsible for instituting what we know of as the university. And he's taking ideas from another guy named Schleiermacher, who really gave us the whole concept of academic freedom. Because freedom and knowledge in Humboldt's vision would be wed in the university. And that would mean that the scholar would be free to pursue knowledge and free to sort of enact the pursuit of knowledge in front of his students. And his students would thereby learn. So it really is sort of you can see the paradigm for the modern university emerging. But it was really a kind of a master-apprentice model still. And you can see that when we have our graduation ceremonies, that's what it used to look like when the bricklayers, and the masons and the glaziers and the tinsmiths, when the guilds would have their graduation ceremonies, when you would go from bachelor to master. And so those trappings that we wear in our ceremonials, the regalia, is a very slim sort of remnant of the guild sort of institution of learning. So academia is not the only profession or trade that has that structure, or had that structure, but it's the only one that really keeps it today in its public way. But after Humboldt designed this idea of the university, which really caught on in the 19th century, early 19th century, and really sort of reigned and kind of took its shape. And by the end of the 19th century, if you were an educated person, you'd gone through Berlin. And so W.E.B. Du Bois, for example, got his real training in sociology in Berlin.
You have Humboldt University.
Humboldt University,
Like one of the
right.
best
Really sort of the standard for a university in the 19th century. Now, the United States, in its way, sort of caught up later in the 19th century. In the United States, Harvard and Yale and Princeton were basically seminaries until after the Civil War. After the Civil War, when it became clear that American industry was taking off and you needed staff for joint stock companies and a managerial administrative class and professionals, doctors were getting professionally trained and science was getting instituted in the United States, or much of it borrowed from Europe. Professional classes, businessmen, but particularly people like lawyers and doctors, wanted to make sure that they had a sort of a guild mentality, and they wanted to protect themselves professionally so that they weren't being competed with by a bunch of quacks who would go out and sell snake oil. And so they professionalized, and they created the university as a place for legitimation of their practices and their knowledge. And so in that development, you have a move away from the old liberal arts model that would have adhered in a college like Harvard, at least as a preliminary to studies in divinity. You would have gotten a sort of undergraduate education in more of the liberal arts in the Tribune and Quadrivium, but then you would have probably gone and specialized in some form of letters, and often for the church. So the development in the United States just sort of lagged by a few generations. When the university model really took hold in the United States as a place for the incipient professions to kind of form themselves into kind of self-regarding bodies and create professional societies and that sort of thing. Education, even at the undergraduate level, became somewhat more specialized, and the sort of the event, if you will, that people sort of gesture at to mark the real sea change in American undergraduate education is the change of the curriculum at Harvard under Charles W. Martin, which is where the elective got invented. You did not have to do what everybody else was doing anymore. You could do a core, and you would have a capstone course. Eliot was very, very clear that he still wanted some people, he wanted everybody to read some of the same things. but not all the time, and not all to the same end, so that you could begin to start getting people ready for professions a little bit before, right? Because, you know, it's an encroaching sort of ideal, and we know it under the term specialization and that sort of thing. But it really began with Charles Eliot Norton in the beginning of the 20th century.
Let me just mention one thing about this. It wasn't as this transition in the Harvard curriculum was not as seamless as it might seem. Eliot was sort of like, this old stuff is ridiculous, because what Harvard had before that was essentially a 3-4 centuries later version of the trivium and the quadrivium. And that was the education. He said, you know, he did like the idea of the capstone and all this. He said, but basically people can take whatever they want, and when they get enough credits, they graduate. And he kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater. It took him a while before all this stuff could get reinstituted. Because what happened when people would take stuff from everywhere, basically people would graduate having taken what we now think of as a 100-level course in every possible area. Nothing that was advanced, and they say, you know, 120 credits or whatever to get their degree. And Eliot realized, you know, this was a little much. This was really not the intention. But it was kind of the I know what you want to call it, the extreme opposite of a fully required curriculum.
Yeah, in structure at least. Now, Norton and the person that we credit with sort of being the, if you will, the, I don't know what term you would use, the father, or sort of the patron saint of our curriculum in particular, from the University of Chicago, Robert Hutchins. You know, they agreed on some things, and that is that there should be, you know, so education should be for more than expertise. It should be for values. It should be for character. It should be for that sort of thing. It should be democratic. But the structure of the education is really what Norton changed at Harvard. And most, you know, Harvard being Harvard, most universities followed suit to one degree or another. So by the 1920s, at most major universities, in fact, probably all major universities in the United States by that time, you had a system of electives and majors and that sort of thing. Now, at Columbia, there was a fellow named John Erskine.
Columbia, New York, not Columbia down the
Sorry, yeah, not Columbia, Chicago, but Columbia University, New York. A fellow named John Erskine comes along and writes an essay called "On the Moral Duty," or is it the moral imperative of being intelligent. This is the name of this essay that he writes, which is very influential, and in which he states the seed of the idea of the great books education, and that is, if you read these great books, if you acculturate yourself to the best that has been thought and said, in Matthew Arnold's phrase, and Matthew Arnold is somebody that in this essay Erskine is looking to for this ideal. So a lot of it is getting imported from England at the time. But he sort of states, sort of in a nutshell, the idea of the great books education, and that is, you read a great book and you deliberate about it, and it's going to have an effect on you, right? And it's going to make you more intelligent. And being intelligent is a requirement to be a moral actor in this world. And so Erskine developed a course, and I can't remember what the name of the course was, but great something. Great ideas or something, anyway, and it gets taken by Mortimer Adler and Mark Van Doren, and nobody else at Columbia wants to teach it, and so Mortimer Adler and Mark Van Doren start teaching it along with Erskine, and they eventually sort of get hounded out of Columbia. Right? The professors at Columbia, you know, professional graduate professors, say, you know, I want, you know, my students to know what they need to know. I don't want them monkeying around with Plato, especially not in the original Greek, right? So the classicists and philologists were also really upset. They were reading Plato in English, right? Which is just, you know, it just wasn't done.
Yeah.
And Erskine said, but it's good for you. But they got hounded out. And one interesting little detour before we get to the University of Chicago, and we turn it over to David. In Greenwich Village, in the post-war years, there was something set up called the People's Academy. The People's Academy was Adler and Van Doren and a guy named Scott Buchanan, who was this huge idealist, and they're all coming out of the war and thinking this war was a disaster. The First World War. Sorry. First World War was a disaster. This is in the 20s. Humanity has lost its way. We need to regain our footing. And what better way to do that than get back in touch with what it was we were fighting for after all, and that is Western civilization. But they wanted to, they really felt like they owed it not simply to a new elite that could lead the country, back into better days, but to the people who fought the war, the people who were sort of fighting for political rights, women, workers, people who had been sort of excluded from the academy to that time. So they started the People's Academy, and they taught a great books curriculum there. So, and Scott Buchanan is one of the people who goes on to found St. John's, along with Stringfellow Bar, who he meets at the University of Chicago. And by that time, the People's Academy sort of mucks along for a few years, and then Buchanan goes off to found St. John's. After Stringfellow Bar comes from Chicago, Scott Buchanan goes to the University of Chicago and tries to get along with Adler there, because Adler is setting up his sinecure under Robert Hutchins to do the great books at Chicago, which had started in 1896 as one of these ultra specialized graduate schools. In fact, the University of Chicago at first was only a graduate school. And I think it was only it's just before the war that they got an undergraduate program. So it was just before the war that they got an undergraduate program. They didn't know quite what to do with it. It was basically sort of, some version of Eliot's kind of let's have them do this and some of this and some of this. And Adler came from Columbia, and Hutchins came from Yale, where he had been the dean of the law school at, I think, 29. He was a sort of a prodigy.
27.
29 when he came to Chicago as president to kind of take this institution that was very well funded by John D. Rockefeller, was the one who built all those buildings down in Hyde Park, by the way. So you have Standard Oil to thank for Hyde Park and the University of Chicago. And with all of that money, they thought things would just sort of go swimmingly, but it kind of faltered, and there was a lot of internal dissension. So Hutchins was brought in to sort of breathe new life into this institution that didn't know quite which way to take. And from there, they headed over to
I have a question. When we talked about sort of the shift that was summed up to me once as the shift from the English model to the German model about 150 years ago, I always understood it as being sort of less about certain players in the academic world and more about the federal government instituting a mandate. And that's a way of certain universities about 150 years ago, like the University of Illinois, to the flagship state universities. Could you speak a little bit to the federal government's role in that transition?
Well, the land grant universities, University of Wisconsin-Madison, Cornell, a lot of the big state schools, were started as basically agricultural schools to help train the people that had been sent out into the land with the Homestead Act in 1863 and since we were farming. And once there were enough people out there and it needed some systematization, they thought, well, we better set up some schools for these people. And so basically they were sort of big extensions, farm bureau extensions. They developed into big research engines, mostly for agricultural science and then for material science.